From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, April 21st, 2015. Baltimore activists are up in arms over the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who died after injuries sustained from an arrest. We'll speak with Farajii Muhammad. And the crisis of Europe's migration hits a boiling point after hundreds die in the Mediterranean. Traveling from Libya, author Behzad Yaghmaian will join us to get the big picture. Plus, 5 years after the BP oil spill, we'll turn to journalist Dahr Jamail on the current state of the Gulf Coast and on proposed new rules for offshore drilling. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
The biggest blast of the 3-week-old Saudi and U.S. war on Yemen took place yesterday. The bombing of what is thought to have been an underground weapons depot in the capital Sana'a set off a major explosion that resembled an earthquake and killed at least 25 people. Among the dead were many women and children, as well as at least 4 employees of a local television station. About 400 were injured. Sana'a is the stronghold of the Houthi Shia rebel group, which has taken over Yemen and whose rule has prompted the war. While the strikes are being conducted by Saudi warplanes, the U.S. is supporting them logistically, providing intelligence and other support. The aid group Oxfam on Sunday announced that one of its storage facilities holding humanitarian supplies in the northwest part of the country had also been bombed. Well, Rahul, if the U.S. is providing intelligence to Saudi fighters, shouldn't this massacre of 25 people be considered the U.S.'s responsibility as well? And plus, Saudi buys most of its weapons from the U.S., right?
Well, sure. The Saudi would not have a military without the United States. And so, in a sense, whatever they do, the United States shares responsibility, whether it's the invasion of Bahrain a couple years ago or this current war on Yemen. It would be a mistake to think that the Saudis are simply doing what the United States wants in the region. But it is clear and rather strange that the United States now, through the Saudis, is intervening on 2 completely different sides in the war in Yemen, the Houthis and Al-Qaeda.
And elsewhere in the Middle East, an Egyptian court announced a 20-year sentence today for former President Mohamed Morsi. Nearly 2 years after he was first arrested and ousted from power, Morsi won the first election of the post-Mubarak era in Egypt, but his rule was marked by the Muslim Brotherhood's heavy-handedness. Under the rule of current President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the former army chief, Egypt's pendulum seems to have swung back toward repression. Morsi was sentenced along with 14 of his fellow Muslim Brotherhood members over a 2012 attack on a sit-in being conducted outside the presidential palace while Morsi was in power. An Amnesty International spokesperson said this verdict shatters any remaining illusion of independence and impartiality in Egypt's criminal justice system. Last year, Hosni Mubarak was acquitted in a case over his role in attacking protesters during the 2011 Egyptian revolution. Well, Rahul, how significant is this 20-year sentence for Mohamed Morsi?
Well, you know, if you think of every one of the recent people in charge in Egypt, whether it's Mubarak, Morsi, or Sisi, has presided over crackdowns that involve the killing, or you could even say the murder of protesters in the streets. Of the 3 of them, Morsi's crimes are by far the least, and if you look at the actual prosecutions and sentences, they're simply reflections of the prevailing political winds. Mubarak first got harsh sentences, then with the Sisi restoration, those were set aside. Morsi's getting a harsh sentence. Sisi, of course, who was cracked down on and killed more protesters than either of them, is not even going to be charged. Well, what's also interesting about this is that Morsi got 20 years and not a death sentence. I think that one of the things that means is that the regime feels that it's in a position of power and stability, and it doesn't want to rock the boat in a way that protests against a death sentence.
And speaking of a travesty of justice here in the United States, a Chicago County judge yesterday dismissed all charges against Dante Servine, a Chicago police officer who fatally shot a 22-year-old African-American woman named Rakia Boyd on March 21, 2012. Prosecutors charged Mr. Servine with involuntary manslaughter for pointing his gun at Ms. Boyd's companion, Antonio Cross, saying he thought Cross had a gun and charged towards him. Cross survived Servine's shots, but Boyd did not. Servine, who was off duty at the time of the shooting, maintains that Boyd's death was an accident. Boyd's brother, Martinez Sutton, screamed in anger in the court as the judge dismissed charges. The decision comes at a time of heightened attention to the killing of unarmed African Americans by U.S. police. Activists point out that the killings of black women have not received enough attention. Well, Rahul, are we any better than Egypt when it comes to justice for the victims of police violence?
Well, I think we should note that when it comes to accountability for the elite, or in this case, servants of the elite, there are lots of countries that impose more accountability. You know, China on CEOs, Egypt occasionally on policemen, depending on, again, which way the political winds are blowing. The United States mostly does not impose accountability. Obviously, we don't want systems like those, but what we have is one of relative impunity. And I think it's also worth pointing out in this case that it's not simply that the officer was acquitted. The judge actually found that by dismissing the case that there was no legally reasonable way to convict him of involuntary manslaughter, even though you'd think that shooting at somebody with a whole bunch of people behind him, obviously inaccurately, is almost a manslaughter.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Rahul, for joining us today. And by the way, we'll be covering the death of Freddie Gray, who, after being arrested by Baltimore police, died in the hospital. Rahul, thanks so much. Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A week after he was arrested under suspicious circumstances by Baltimore police officers, 25-year-old Freddie Gray died in the hospital. He had been in coma after 80% of his neck vertebrae were severed. Despite extensive surgeries to revive him, he died. Before his April 12th encounter with police, the young African-American man had been in perfect health. Cell phone footage of the arrest shows officers bending over him while Gray screamed. He continued screaming while being escorted into a police vehicle while handcuffed, suggesting he was in deep pain. Here is an excerpt of an early news report showing the video footage.
Witnesses capture the final moments of an arrest that send this man to shock trauma.
Deputy Commissioner Jerry Rodriguez said of the footage, at no time, and I've seen the video a number of times, did I see a use of force at that moment. But instead of providing Gray with medical treatment that he clearly needed, police put him in an additional restraint and took him to the station. Half an hour later, he was taken to the hospital. Now, Gray's family and anti-police brutality activists want answers. They want to know why there is a gap in the police timeline where it is not clear what exactly happened to Gray. They also want to know why Gray was arrested in the first place. Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake and Police Commissioner Anthony Batts have announced an internal investigation into the matter. 6 officers have been suspended with pay in connection to the case. We turn now to Farajii Muhammad. He's the Youth Empowerment Program Director for Baltimore with the American Friends Service Committee. He also hosts a radio program called Listen Up that airs on Public Radio 88.9 WEAA in Baltimore. Hi, Farajii.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. Well, another young black man is dead after being arrested by the police. What can you tell us about Freddie Gray? Who was he? And do you know why he was even stopped by the police? They say he was illegally carrying a knife, but then they only charged him with that after they stopped him and found it in his pocket.
Absolutely. What happened was that Freddie Gray, he was a young brother that lived in the Sandtown, Winchester area of town, the Gilmore Homes community, which is in West Baltimore. And one of the things about him, according to some of the reports, that he had made some eye contact with police earlier that morning, about 8:40 in the morning. He made eye contact. They found in his records that he did distribute some type of weed or marijuana back in the past. But of course, that was something that's not relevant to now at this point. But there was some eye contact. That area of town, Sandtown, Winchester, Gilmore Homes area, is a very high drug, high crime area. So essentially, when he made that eye contact with police and when he saw the police presence kind of really taking a look at him, he fled. And essentially that led to them pursuing him and then detaining him. There were a couple of things about this that we need to keep in mind, that when you are in a high crime area, and I've learned that the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court allows a police officer to pursue and detain a person of interest in a high crime area, especially if the police feels that there's probable cause. And so that's what essentially happened. He looks at the police look at him, he feels a certain way, he's running. And so the police automatically assumed that there was something going on with him. The knife thing really, like you said, didn't come up until after they searched his persons, which really showed that that was not, and the mayor said it herself, carrying a knife is not necessarily illegal. So that wasn't even something that should be a part of the conversation. So the fact is that he ran, he lived in a high crime area, and the police felt that it was probable cause. So that's looking at one part of this case. The second part of this case is something that I have yet to really hear a lot more about, which was the use of force that the police had made on Brother Freddie. Because the police, as part of their procedure in taking down a person of interest or a suspect, they are allowed to literally put their knee in the back of an individual to keep that person detained. And that's exactly what you saw in the video, and that's what happened. But that, again, causes a big issue for a person that has asthma or any other type of medical condition, that if you put your knee in somebody's back or on their spine, that's naturally going to cause. And if you just have not just one officer, but you have two officers using that type of procedure for a takedown, then that certainly is going to cause a major problem.
Now,
so
Farajii, 80% of his vertebrae at his neck were severed. Asthma or any other pre-existing condition isn't going to cause that. This was a young man who was riding a bicycle, so clearly he had full use of his spine and his legs before he was arrested. And what else could have happened to him between the time that he was arrested and the time that he ended up in the hospital, other than the police? The police happened to him, right?
Right, the police happened to him, and we don't have any video footage has arisen just yet of anything of showing that interaction within that time period. We just see the video footage of him already being on the ground,
right,
and then the police literally dragging him from the ground into the paddy wagon.
And actually, we have that second video. There were two cell phone videos, right, that emerged of the arrest, after the arrest. In the footage we saw earlier, he's screaming in pain. Here's a second video by another bystander, who the person actually taking the video is convinced that his Freddie Gray's leg is broken.
Right. Right. His leg look broke. Look at his leg. Look at his leg. That boy's leg look broke. His leg broken. Y'all dragging him like that.
And that is a second video that was taken of Freddie Gray being dragged into the car. And is it possible, Farajii, that the very act of the arrest caused the injuries? Then they made him sit in handcuffs in the car. We now know that they apparently put him in leg irons in the car because he was agitated. If one is in pain because one's spine has been broken, obviously one is going to be agitated. Instead of taking him to the hospital, they took him to the police station.
Yeah, which is very strange to me, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but it seems very strange that one, it took so long for the for any type of medical procedures to be done, and they had in the report where it says that he got irate, and that's why they had to make the stop to put him in leg braces. And you're absolutely correct. This doesn't make any sense. The case doesn't play out. The thing is about this particular case is that, again, it shows that this is not one quote unquote one isolated incident. This is the interaction that young black males are having with the police each and every day in America. And what we strive to do with these piece by piece and the others that are on the ground working to ensure that these things don't continue to happen is to show that, look, this is something that is a pattern. This is something that is continuing to happen. This shows that the police really do not take the lives of black people in the city. It's not taken as being valuable, and that this case really shows that the justice system is not working, and especially it targets black people in this country. And that's the unfortunate part about this process. The other part about this is that the police officers, the 6 police officers that were involved in this case have been suspended with pay, but then they have what they call a law enforcement bill of rights, which allows police officers 10 days from a time of an incident to essentially get information about the case, to gather their side, to get their side of the story together, to talk to a lawyer provided by the Fraternal Order of Police, and they essentially be able to do all of this stuff before they make any particular or formal statement to any officer that may be investigating the case. So tomorrow we found that the 10th day or that time frame tomorrow will have expired. So we're expecting that the police officers will move forward on giving a statement. However, look at all that has happened since this case got a national attention. It's going to be very hard for the police officers to not absolve themselves of any type of guilt or absolve themselves of any type of wrongdoing. They're going to make sure that they say that they're going to say what they think is going to be right and that can be upheld. And this is why here in the city of Baltimore and all across the state that we were fighting and have been fighting to make sure we change this law enforcement bill of rights condition for 10 days, because if you and I had a chance to do this, we would not have been given 10 days.
Right, of course. Different standards, it seems, for police. Now, this isn't the first time that Baltimore police have come under scrutiny. Last year, the Baltimore Sun did an investigation that found that residents of the city have suffered broken bones and battered faces during arrests. The city has paid $5.7 million in court judgments and settlements in 102 civil suits alleging police brutality since 2011. Now, those injuries that other people have suffered are consistent with what Freddie Gray suffered. We didn't even mention yet on this interview that his face appeared swollen, that it appeared as though he had been beaten. The Baltimore Police Department was supposed to be investigated by federal officials, right? What happened to that?
Right. Well, what happened is that this last week, the Department of Justice did come into the city, and the Department of Justice has actually been doing an inquiry based upon the mayor and the police commissioner's request to come into Baltimore since late last year, and I'm told the timeline was around October or so of last year that they came in and they started to do their inquiry. So last week on Thursday, the Department of Justice actually held a town hall meeting, not a press conference, but a town hall meeting with residents, and over 300 residents took a stand and decided to say enough is enough, and gave the Department of Justice a litany of issues that they've been having here with the Baltimore City Police Department. And as a result of that, our hope is that the Department of Justice truly sees that this is an issue, not just in Baltimore, but all across the country. And then you're right, that here's the thing about that piece of money getting paid out to those who have become victims of police brutality. Here in the city of Baltimore and in the state, the maximum amount of money that it can actually be paid out to a victim is $200,000 or less. And the other part about that is that when residents do get any type of financial compensation about their brutality case, then they also have to sign a contract stating that they cannot speak about their cases either publicly or privately. So essentially they're given like a gag order to not even speak about this. And this is something else that we're fighting to, because we're saying if you have an issue of brutality, then you should be able to speak about that, so that way the culture of change can set in, and then it doesn't look like you're hiding or covering something.
Right.
That's where the transparency and the accountability really has to kick in. It starts with the victim and not just with the officers.
Now, going back to the specifics of the Freddie Gray case, Deputy Commissioner Rodriguez said that at no time did he see use of force in the arrest. He said he's seen the cell phone video, which, of course, again, doesn't make sense. How did this young man who was riding his bicycle all of a sudden end up in the hospital in a coma? The only thing that happened to him was the arrest. Rodriguez also went on to say, early on, I can say with certainty we have no physical video or any other evidence of an altercation that would have resulted in this. So the question is how and why. But didn't the police record the arrest on their dash cams? Aren't they supposed to be recording some of these sorts of interactions? And are they talking about having such video or going to be releasing such video?
There has been some talk about the video. However, what they haven't, as far as I know, that there hasn't been a release of that video by the Baltimore City Police Department yet. But there certainly has been some talk about the police having footage of that of that interaction, and we're waiting to see how that plays out. And let me just go to say that the family of Brother Freddie Gray is not confident at all that the police is going to really be forthcoming about how this whole incident was handled. The police commissioner has vowed to make this a priority and make that he is going to get the officers and make sure that there's greater accountability and transparency. But the police and the commissioner is one man, and the commissioner can be handcuffed but so much by the fact that he has a department that continues to kind of go and do these violations without any real punishment. And so the video that we're waiting from the police, we got to make sure that the video is first released, and then secondly, that the video shows the truth, that it's not doctored or edited in any shape, way, or form, so that way people can know what the full story is. But I'm not too confident, to be very honest with you, that the full story is really going to come out unless there's some legal documents that are coming that's going to come from this case. Because as of right now, it's a very emotional time here in the city of Baltimore. A lot of young people and a lot of the folks in the community are upset, and we're trying to figure out what the next step is. But I'll say this, that as we're talking about moving forward or moving the issues forward, we have to look at the system that is allowing these things to happen. These aren't isolated incidents, like I said before. These are incidents where people are just happen to do these things. We got to do a thorough analysis of what's going on and really come to grip with the truth and the actual fact that this is a major issue on a very systemic level. And so what our job is with Piece by Piece of AFSC is to make sure that we're breaking down the systems that allow these things to happen. You have a community who has already been decimated and has already been made to put into a hopeless position. With this case only deepens the wounds, and it's going to be so hard to try to restore any particular quote unquote trust between the police and the community. It's definitely not going to happen over the next couple of weeks. It may not even happen over the next few months. There's going to have to be some real concerted effort by both the police and the citizens of that community. But we have to see some major changes on both sides of the issue. Well, it can't just be one thing or another.
Farajii, just following up on what you were mentioning about this being an emotional time in the community, finally, we don't talk enough about the trauma that communities face when they see one of their own being treated in this way and their lives being thought of as so worthless. And Black lives are being lost, but Black families are grieving, Black communities are grieving. And we as a society seem to be desensitized to that grief, as well as, of course, the lives being lost. And I'm wondering if you can finally comment on the fact that that grief is real. How are people dealing with it?
Well, you know, it's interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we had this past weekend was Piece by Piece Baltimore, the 1199 SEIU Workers Union, Casa de Maryland. We held a rally called the Be More March to Justice, Just Us rally where we did a rally in support of the 100 activists coming from New York to DC about this issue.
Right, a group of people marching, yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the key components of our program on Saturday was to hear from the family of victims that have been really impacted the most by police brutality and police misconduct. And as we saw, and as I personally saw, that there has to be some real healing first by the community acknowledging the fact that this pain is real. I think that if we continue to hold that back inside and as a collective, that if we continue to say, well, you know, that's just the way it is in this part of the city, then we're never going to get past the healing, get to that point of healing that you speak of. But the other part about it is that we have to have some professionals, and I'm a strong proponent of the fact that we need to have some individuals that are going to be able to come in and to do some healing work with those brothers and sisters who are impacted by this, who see this, who experience this on a day-to-day. It's not just enough to have community activists in there. The real community actors also has to be those individuals who deal with psychological trauma, the individuals that can deal with psychiatric trauma. I mean, these things are real, and they will have a very, very significant impact on how you see yourself, your community, and the world around you, especially those in authority over you. So there has to be a greater call to action to bring those folks into the community that understand the culture of that community, that can be able to speak to those young men, young women in that community to get us to a point where our pain doesn't become our impediment, but our pain can become a source of our power.
Farajii, thank you so much for all the work you're doing and for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Farajii Muhammad is the Youth Empowerment Program Director for Baltimore with the American Friends Service Committee, and he hosts a radio program called Listen Up that airs on Public Radio 88.9 WEAA in Baltimore. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Nearly 1,000 migrants died attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea into Europe over the weekend. The accident occurred over the weekend, came just days after an earlier vessel capsized, resulting in 400 deaths. Migrants from Mali, Eritrea, Syria, and Libya were among the dead. Representatives of dozens of European Union nations gathered for an emergency meeting in Luxembourg this week to decide on steps to mitigate the humanitarian disaster. Italy, which is often the first location where migrants arrive, ended its year-long, highly successful search and rescue operation in 2014. After most European governments refused to provide funding. The Mare Nostrum program saved 100,000 lives before being replaced by a program with a third of the funding. This week's boat accident might be the Mediterranean's worst migrant disaster. At least 200 women and children were thought to have been on board, at least some of them locked below deck. There have only been a few dozen survivors so far. My guest is Behzad Yaghmaian. He's a professor of political economy at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He's the author of Embracing the Infidels, Stories of Muslim Migrants on the Journey West. Welcome to Uprising, Behzad.
Good having me.
Now, I understand that one of the reasons why these boats are capsizing, before we get into the broader issues of why people go, how they are received, but on the specifics, the folks who are arranging the transportation in places like Libya are packing the boats with as many humans as possible, warning them not to move about. When people do inevitably start moving about the boat, water enters the boat, it starts to fill. Before you know it, the boat is sinking. In this particular case, it was thought that the Tunisian captain actually ran it into another boat, and he has been charged. Why are so many of these boats capsizing? Is it that they're just being packed to the brim?
We lost connection.
Can you hear me, Behzad? We can hear you.
I can hear you now, yeah.
Why are so many of these boats capsizing?
First of all, the boats are small compared to the number of people who go aboard. There are flimsy boats, there are smaller boats, they're overpacked beyond capacity. And the sea is rough. And you have to notice that the capsizing of these fishing boats or bigger boats that Libya to Italy are only a new example of boats that have been used by migrants in the past 10, 20 years in the Mediterranean Sea. Prior to this, prior to Libya becoming a failed state, therefore becoming a hub for migration from Africa and the Middle East to Italy, migrants were going through smaller inflatables. And those boats were capsizing. Many migrants were dying, but not in large numbers at one time. So you would have 5 migrants dying in one incident, another 10, another 5, another 6. But the total numbers were not less than these. So at this point, because of the position of Libya, because Libya is a failed state, there is no government, there is no rule, there is no law. So Libya has become another Somalia, a sending state without a government to control the movement of people. So this has become a positioning place, a platform, to say, for human smugglers to use boats that are not actually suitable for this number of people on the sea.
So people from Eritrea, from other countries, Mali, etc., are coming to Libya as a point of departure for Europe?
Yes. You know, prior to 2011, there were sub-Saharan Africans in Libya who were living in Libya and trying to leave Libya to go to Europe. But the numbers were small. But after 2011, after the fiasco that was created by the failure of the Arab Spring, you have a new influx of people coming from Syria and other Arab states to Libya. As well, you have older populations who used to go through Libya, and also a group of people who had used other routes to the European Union, Greece, Morocco, and other places. Those places have become less favorable now because of the existing strong governments that stop the flow of people. So in the past 4 years, Libya has become a more attractive place because of the loss of the state, because of the existence of a failed state. So the number of people who used to go or would go otherwise through Greece or through Morocco have declined. And the number of people through Libya have increased now.
So, Behzad, the European response to migration had been that, you know, if you actually rescue people, more will want to come, that it will encourage people coming. So the flip side of that is that the EU, if the EU let them die, fewer will come. I mean, the deterrent effects of death, is that what they're relying on?
No, so I'm glad you asked. So the European response is actually a faulty response. Europe is caught between the shame of having a mounting number of deaths at its borders and the unwillingness to accept migrants in a regular and orderly way. So what they have come up with yesterday is a continuation and actually intensification of the old policy of border control and the militarization of the borders on one hand and rescue and save on the other hand. But really, the focus is to prevent migrants from coming to the Mediterranean Sea and forcing the European Union to save them. Like, if you remember, you actually mentioned that in your earlier remarks, that Italy stopped its rescue and save operation in October after a year-long operation. And there was a promise that the Italian program would be replaced by a European-wide program. Britain actually opposed the European-wide program, arguing that save and rescue and save programs are actually a pull factor. They encourage more migrations and more death. Well, we saw that the stopping of the rescue and save program actually did not end migration. More people came and more people died. So having a program to save migrants is neither a deterrent nor a pull factor. We have to understand the causes of migration. Why do people move? Why has there been an increasing number of people on the move these days? And what is there to protect their lives? Unfortunately, the current migration crisis that we are facing is the intersection of multiple crises to which we have not provided any answer. For example, we don't have an international protection regime to deal with the types of migrants that are leaving their homes and trying to or hoping to reach the European Union. The only international protection regime we have was actually created in response to the Cold War. It's a 1951 Geneva Convention that defines who is a refugee. So a refugee is a person who is persecuted, who has a fear of persecution by the state, by their government, based on 5 categories. Well, since 1951, we have had a host of other types of migration that have emerged, to which we have not provided any type of protection. And we're actually using a false and inadequate typology of migration. We have forced migrants versus voluntary migrants. We call economic migrants voluntary migrants, therefore not capable, not needing protection by other states. Well, in fact, what we see now that a lot of the economic migrants are forced to migrate because of policies that are imposed in their countries, because of the increasing inequalities created by international policies, because of the environmental crisis, because of conflicts that have created inability for people to survive. So survival deficiencies and security gaps are causing people to move. And we don't have a typology of migration, an international protection regime to deal with that. So because of these, in the past 20 years or so, and now particularly after the Arab Spring, after the catastrophic failure of the Arab Spring, we have had a growing number of people that are displaced by events beyond their control. We call these subjects of crisis migration. What we see today is a large form and array of crisis migration. So on one hand, we have the growing number of people trying to leave. On the other hand, the capacity and the willingness of the rest of the world to absorb these people has declined. So you have the lack of international protection regime, you have the growing number of people trying to reach somewhere with a perceived notion of better security. And you have the inability and unwillingness of these countries to absorb, hence a colossal humanitarian crisis to which we don't have any solution in sight at this point. Well, there are some minor things that can be done.
Well, and I want to talk to you about what the European Union officials have considered in Luxembourg and what advice you could give them. But on this issue of the fact that there aren't any easy answers, among the countries that did a search and rescue operation yesterday was Malta. The Maltese Prime Minister, Joseph Malta, said, "A tragedy is unfolding in the Mediterranean." And Joseph Muscat, that is his name. "A tragedy is unfolding in the Mediterranean, and if the EU and the world continue to close their eyes, they will be judged in the harshest terms, as it was judged in the past when it closed its eyes to genocides, when the comfortable did nothing." I mean, those are really strong words. Behzad, do you agree with this sentiment? And should we remind ourselves, put this sort of framework on it when we're talking about solutions to this crisis?
Absolutely. I totally agree with this. What happened yesterday was also called a massacre. And this is just one example. The fact that we're paying attention to this is because 900 people died in one incident. But as I said before, there have been a growing number of people dying every year, but in small pieces, therefore not catching our attention. The crisis is real. But what happened yesterday in Brussels was far from adequate in responding to this. Actually, what came out yesterday, in addition to what I would actually welcome, the rescue and save operation, is a further militarization of the Mediterranean Sea and the militarization of border policy. So what they did yesterday was they decided to go after the human smugglers and destroy their boats, as if there were no smugglers, there would be no flow of migration. This is based on a faulty understanding of migration. Human smugglers only facilitate the passage of people.
Well, Behzad, it sounds like Europe is taking a page out of the U.S.'s book, and the U.S. is on immigration crisis at its border with Mexico.
Absolutely. We build a wall, they're going to militarize the sea. Their border is a sea.
Now, a few years ago, you wrote a piece in Counterpunch called "The Spectre of a Black Europe," in which you point out that the deals that European leaders make with the leaders of countries where the migrants are coming from are quite problematic. What sort of deals are being made, and why are they problematic?
Okay, so let's begin with yesterday, because yesterday another decision was made that the EU should cooperate with the governments of Libya, Egypt, and also Niger to stop and to actually halt and stop the flow of migration. or actually to end what they call, quote unquote, migratory routes. What does that mean is they're going to use the help of the governments in these countries to block the movement of people. So migrants who have already come to Libya will be trapped in Libya with no possibility of leaving Libya for the European Union. Two questions emerge here. There is no state in Libya. Which government of Libya is the EU going to cooperate with? Secondly, what will be happening to the migrants who are trapped in Libya? Libya is in a notorious civil war. Now, at this point, we have an unknown number of people in tens of thousands from across Africa and the Middle East that are trapped in Libya and waiting for their time and their turn to move, get on boats and go to the European Union, hoping to get to the European Union. Blocking that would actually further endanger their lives. They're not going to go back.
And we should remind ourselves, of course, the U.S. and NATO, so U.S. and European allies, led the initial intervention in Libya that you can really trace the current situation back to.
So the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, actually created a situation that turned Libya into a hub. But prior to this, in 2000, Italy signed what was called a friendship pact with the government of Gaddafi. And the deal was that Gaddafi would receive, I think, 5 billion euros from Italy in return for helping to block the movement of sub-Saharan Africans through Libya to Italy. Well, the deal failed because Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011. We're trying to recreate the same types of policies and the same types of deals now with the dictators in Egypt, with Sisi's government, and also, I don't know really who in Libya, because the European Union does not know with who.
And I should also mention, finally, that in recent years, European commentators have been making a big deal about falling birth rates in many Western European nations. And, if they cared about simply having population growth, all they have to do is allow migrants to come in. But, of course, those migrants are black and brown, not European whites, and that might be part of the problem. Behzad, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much. Behzad Yaghmaian is a professor of political economy at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He is the author of Embracing the Infidel Stories of Muslim Migrants on the Journey West. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at the 5th anniversary of the BP oil spill. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. 5 years ago, the nation's worst industrial disaster took place off the shore of the Gulf Coast as the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, owned and operated by British firm BP, exploded. 11 souls lost their lives, and the underwater well began gushing millions of gallons of crude oil into the ocean. The oil didn't stop spewing for months, and all the while BP applied dispersants to dissolve it into the ocean water. Unsurprisingly, the disaster and its aftermath have been marked by corporate deception and profiteering. Today, those whose livelihoods were impacted continue to demand justice and compensation, even though the U.S. government reached a $4.5 billion settlement with BP on top of the $14 billion that it spent for cleanup. Meanwhile, the Obama administration has just released a new set of rules on offshore drilling as companies await permits to drill off the Alaska coast in the Chukchi Sea. My guest is Dahr Jamail, Truth Out staff reporter. He's written a number of books, including The Will to Resist, Soldiers Who Refuse to Fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq. He's won the Martha Gellhorn Award for Investigative Journalism, among other awards. Welcome to Uprising, Dahr.
Thanks, Sonali. Good to be with you.
Now, in your latest piece for Truth Out, you write about the BP spill 5 years later, but from the perspective of those who lost their livelihoods and who are suing attorney Kenneth Feinberg, a man who's charged with overseeing compensation for BP's victims. You describe Feinberg as, quote, a fox guarding a chicken house. Why is that a good description for him? How have ordinary people not been compensated?
Well, he was basically brought in, and this is the perception of the majority of the people who filed claims through the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, of which he became the head of shortly after the spill and ran for nearly 2 years. And most of the people along the Gulf Coast who suffered damages, financial, health, et cetera, and filed a claim, that's where I got that saying from that I wrote about in the article of him being the fox guarding the chicken coop, because they perceived him as being really little more than a defense attorney hired on by BP to brought in and to minimize their liability, because he did things like tried to force through a policy where anyone who worked on a cleanup crew, for example, and earned money cleaning up oil, that money would be deducted from their claim amount. So things like this, and the fact that he was paid $1.25 million a month, his firm was, to run the GCCF. So by the time he finished working for essentially BP, who was paying him, he'd been paid $25 million. So just a few things like this, along with the fact that the vast majority of the people who filed claims didn't get anywhere near the amount of money that they lost and needed to be compensated for.
So he was being paid, he and his firm were being paid by BP to compensate the victims of BP. And so in what world would he have anybody else's interest other than BP's?
Well, that's exactly the point, and it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to see right through this setup and who's going to benefit from it. In fact, when the GCCF, the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, was first set up, the first thing that they did was clearly a tactic used to try to minimize BP's loss and the amount of money they would have to pay out to compensation victims. And so one of the things they did is, as an individual, you could sign a statement saying, yes, I need compensation, but I promise not to sue BP now or any time in the future, at which point you would get a $5,000 immediate payout. Businesses could do the same and get a $25,000 immediate payout. But then in BP, actually, well over 50% of all the payouts were of that type. And that was clearly a damage remediation move, to where they went out, basically tried to minimize their loss, get as many of those people on board as possible, take advantage of the fact that people were absolutely desperate. Fishing season had been canceled in the impact zone. People were losing money like crazy. Businesses were hurting immediately. And people were desperate, literally. How am I going to pay my mortgage this month? How am I going to pay my bills? My kid needs to go see the doctor. People were desperate for some kind of income to replace what had been lost. And so well over 50% of the people filing claims actually went that route, and that was a coup for BP.
So they got that many people to sign agreements saying that they wouldn't sue further. Now, what about this current lawsuit against Feinberg? Is it based on this conflict of interest that people say he had since he was being paid by BP?
That's exactly what it's based on. Brian Donovan Law Group out of Florida is representing several clients who, as individuals, are suing Feinberg's firm for basically a lot of the things that we've just discussed. That they feel like it's been completely unfair. They took Feinberg at his words at several points along the way. They're quoting things that he said to the media, and during a lot of the meetings that he would periodically roll through the Gulf Coast and hold these public meetings in the impact zone and talk with spill victims. So they're using a lot of his own information to try to show, look, he in no way represented the GCCF fairly. He in no way acted in the interests of people that he was supposedly trying to help get compensation from BP. And this is backed up even by a 2011 ruling by Judge Carl Barbier, the judge over the general BP trial that the federal government has against BP, who in fact came out and said and issued an order that Feinberg had to quit trying to claim that he did not work for BP and that he was independent, because that's what he was going around telling people who were trying to get compensation. And even the judge had to step in and say, you have to quit saying that, because that's just not the case.
Now, Dahr Jamail, let's step back and look at what else has happened, or really we should say not happened, over the last 5 years since the BP disaster, the worst industrial disaster in the Gulf Coast. The LA Times summarized what has not yet been done since the oil spill to guard against future incidents and accidents. Congress, quote, has not enacted the offshore drilling safety measures recommended by the President's Oil Spill Commission. It has not given strong regulatory powers to the agency that replaced the scandal-scarred Minerals Management Service, and it has not raised the ridiculously low cap of $75 million for corporate liability on major spills. Congress has also failed to make money available for an oil spill research fund. A proposed safety institute hasn't materialized. Neither has the new training center for federal regulators meant to help them carry out more rigorous inspections of offshore rigs. Dahr Jamail, that is a lot of stuff that hasn't been done yet. It's been 5 years. Why has there been such reluctance?
That is a lot, and that's a really great set of bullet points that give people an idea of how rigged the system is unintended in favor of big oil. In fact, up until this recent development, the only thing that changed, and I got this information from the Coast Guard commander in charge of disaster response. He's the federal on-scene site coordinator for the region where BP's rig blew up. And he told me that the only thing that had changed up until this point was, over the 5-year period, was that drilling companies had to be able to prove that they could cap a blowout well. They didn't have to have the cap constructed. They didn't have to have it on site. They didn't even have to have it on shore. And that, bearing in mind, that was why it took BP 87 days to plug this well, because they didn't even have such a thing. The only thing that changed is they had to be able to prove on paper that they could do that. So it's just minuscule steps, and it just really shows the power of the oil and gas industry in the federal government, as was evidenced during the spill itself, when literally BP ran everything, including Coast Guard operations during the cleanup.
And this is really uncharted territory. I mean, the technology of offshore drilling, deep water offshore drilling, is very complex. You mentioned BP couldn't, didn't have the available technology or infrastructure to cap the well after it initially exploded, which I understand they now essentially know that it was a methane bubble that came through, not something that they could necessarily control for. But this was so far below the surface of the ocean, it's almost a mile down, where the chemistry and the physics are quite different. Companies want to expand their offshore operations even after this horrific accident. Won't more such operations make more such accidents more likely, given that Congress hasn't really held BP's feet to the fire?
The experts I speak to about these issues say it's not if, it's when. It's just a matter of time. The fact is that there's been drilling happening in the Gulf of Mexico at twice the depth of the Deepwater Horizon, which was just over 5,000 feet deep. We have drilling happening now in over 10,000 feet of water, and it keeps pushing further offshore because that's where they're having to go to get more reserves to bring oil up out of. So it really is amazing that we haven't had another major disaster. And again, with these kind of weak regulations that have been pushed through. Another point I need to add to these new regulations that were just announced, the companies have 3 to 5 years before they even have to respond to these, and they have to start implementing them. So it's really just kind of a time buying mechanism, and then we'll see what happens with enforcement. We saw how well the last ones were enforced with the whole MMS debacle. So it really is, I think, a situation, unfortunately, of not if there's going to be another major disaster out there, but when is it going to happen and what's it going to look like.
And MMS is the Minerals and Management Service, a government agency charged with regulating these sorts of operations. Now, the rules that were released, the regulations that were released last Monday, they include mandating outside audits of equipment, requiring each device to have a backup shear to cut a pipe, calling for real-time monitoring onshore for heat and pressure of the well. Apparently, these are some of the things that already companies have voluntarily taken on because it seems like it would be prudent for their business operations. And most media are reporting the rules that the industry is quite happy with these rules. That, of course, makes me suspicious. If the industry is happy to comply with these because they've already been kind of doing this, they can't be very strict, can they?
Well, exactly. If the industry's happy with it, then I think that kind of ends the discussion. If it were real regulations, then it was going to cost them the amount of money they would need to spend to even start pretending to do something like this safely. And I don't even know if that's possible. And a lot of the experts I've spoken with have said the same thing, that they would be upset, they would be fighting it, they would be trying to get it changed, they would be, probably lawsuits against the government for this kind of regulation. And we're seeing none of that. And I think that really says it all.
And finally, Dahr Jamail, in the discussions on the 5th anniversary of the BP oil spill, there's been very little focus on the bigger picture, which is the need to move away, not just from offshore drilling, but from fossil fuel consumption to begin with, given our climate reality. No one's talking about that.
Well, exactly. And this is another case in point where it dovetails perfectly in with the Leave It in the Ground movement that's spreading across the world, where we shouldn't even be extracting this stuff, let alone burning it in the first place. And yet, charging forward for more technology, we got to be able to drill deeper. But yeah, this is, again, it's a conversation we shouldn't even be having, because this ideally shouldn't even be happening, because it's lunacy to be thinking about going deeper, pulling out yet more oil to burn it, when we need to be going literally in the opposite direction.
There is a 2-month comment period that the public has to comment on these proposed regulations that are supposed to be the stronger regulations for offshore drilling. I doubt that the public is going to respond. There's very little breaking down for ordinary people what these regulations mean. There has been very little outreach, but perhaps on the Gulf Coast, people might be paying attention. What sort of public response can there be, ought there to be, on these regulations?
Well, hopefully there's a lot of environmental groups that are getting involved that do have the capability to stop these things, or at least slow them down to buy some more time so there can be a more appropriate response. So perhaps NRDC or Justice, Center for Biological Diversity, et cetera, they have at least a little bit of time now to look in and see if there's going to be the possibility of some lawsuits to slow this down, because at this point, that's, I think, the one thing that there is to work with.
Well, Dahr Jamail, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sonali.
And we will post a link to Dahr's latest article about the BP oil spill that you can find at truthout.org. If you miss it, go to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Dahr Jamail is a Truth Out staff reporter. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscriptions sustain the TV production of Uprising. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.